Hello, I'm Arkady Sakhartov. Today I am presenting a study co-authored with Jeff Roer entitled Economies of Scope and Optimal Due Diligence in Corporate Acquisitions. Economies of scope have long been highlighted as a primary motivation for mergers and acquisitions. Such economies represent value that can be added only when an acquirer and the target merge into a single firm. Existing research classified economies of scope into two types. Intratemporal economies of scope, often casually termed synergy, occur when resources are contemporaneously shared between the businesses combined by a firm, in the context of the corporate acquisition between the merged businesses. In turn, intertemporal economies of scope, also known as redeployability, are realized when resources are withdrawn from one of the firm's businesses and redeployed to another business in the firm. Again, in the specific context of corporate acquisitions, when resources are redeployed between the target's business and the acquirer's business. Both types of economies are enhanced by relatedness, the similarity of resource requirements between businesses that makes it easier for the firm to share or redeploy resources between them. Consultants have repeatedly warned managers that M&A deals often fail to deliver economies of scope, specifically due to inadequate due diligence of such economies, when acquirers overestimate them and fall into the synergy trap. Conversely, a very careful due diligence of such economies was named a hard key to the M&A success. That conventional wisdom expressed by consultants is further corroborated in books and magazines targeting managers and suggesting that with the high risk that synergies never materialize or are very costly to achieve, acquirers cannot be too diligent with respect to such economies. As business gurus put that, the knowledge is power mantra could not be more appropriate than in describing the value of genuine due diligence. Acquirers should be very skeptical about the target's asking price, specifically its part reflecting economies of scope, and should prepare to walk away from the deal if that price exceeds the value diagnosed in extensive due diligence. What do we strategy researchers think about the extent to which corporate acquirers should commit to due diligence of economies of scope? It turns out that we concurred with, or at least did not reject, the popular appeal to the most careful due diligence. This is not surprising then that with such an appeal, acquisition due diligence is cited in strategy research very frequently and very positively. But except for a very few theoretical models on the strategic factor market intelligence that keep agnostic about economies of scope, none of more than 360 strategy studies published in top journals cast due diligence as an explained concept or as a predicted dependent variable. Our study aims to develop a more nuanced view of due diligence of economies of scope and to offer a theory of this important aspect of acquisition deal-making. Although it is natural for an acquirer to want the most accurate assessment of a target's value that would protect the acquirer from the adverse selection problem, due diligence poses considerable demands on the time and attention of the acquirer's management. Also, instead of indiscriminately advocating the most extensive due diligence, it should be placed in the specific context of economies that are inherent in an acquisition deal, but that might be compromised by the incomplete information about them. With this approach, we investigate the extent of due diligence that is optimal for a specific context of economies of scope. We use a formal model to build a theory of acquisition due diligence. The model derives both the optimal due diligence effort and the net return to the acquirer that results from that effort. Our model of acquisition due diligence involves the following three conditions that are necessary for the deal. First, the deal should add value above and beyond the value that two merging firms can create separately from each other. To accommodate this condition, the model considers the two types of economies of scope, synergy and redeployability, which are both enhanced by relatedness between the merging firms. Second, the price paid by the acquirer for the target must be at least as high as the next best bid. We follow the approach established in research on asset pricing in incomplete markets, where such markets face ambiguity about economies of scope and form the alternative bid based on that ambiguity. And third, by committing due diligence, the acquirer arrives at the estimate of the target's value that is at least as high as the deal price. But the difference between the acquirer's improved estimate and the deal price should not be offset by the due diligence effort. Otherwise, that difference would not compensate the acquirer for the costliness of due diligence. This figure shows the effects of redeployability and of ambiguity on optimal due diligence. To remind, redeployability of resources between the merging firms is enhanced by relatedness of their businesses to each other. The key observation here is the diagonal reach for the optimal due diligence effort. This result means that neither the weakest nor the strongest relatedness between the target and the acquirer requires the highest due diligence effort. Also, neither the lowest nor the highest ambiguity leads to the highest due diligence effort. This non-monotonicity of both effects is a novel finding that can be explained intuitively with the following three patterns. First, the optimal due diligence is 0 in the bottom right corner because at the right margin the two businesses are perfectly related to each other and thus have identical resource requirements. Accordingly, redeployability of resources between such businesses is the highest possible. This highest redeployability naturally attracts not only the focal acquirer, but also any other similar buyer. Because ambiguity is the lowest in the bottom right corner, due diligence cannot create information asymmetry between alternative bidders. Thus, the focal acquirer confronts a very high competitive bid for very strong economies from resource redeployment from another, equally informed buyer, and would have to pay for the target as much as it is worth to the acquirer regardless of due diligence. Second, further to the left, redeployment is more and more selective. Not only the advantage of the current margin in the recipient business, over the business from which resources are withdrawn should exceed the redeployment cost, but also the time considered for such redeployment should be better than any future time. This more restrictive rule on resource redeployment poses higher demand on the quality of information about redeployability, thus justifying the increase of the optimal due diligence in the direction from the right margin to the ridge. Besides, with lower quality of publicly available information farther from the bottom margin, the stronger demand for improving that quality becomes pertinent, explaining the growth of the optimal due diligence from the bottom margin to the diagonal ridge. Third, a dark blue quarter circle to the northwest of the ridge shows that the acquirer undertakes no due diligence in that area. That sudden drop in optimal due diligence occurs because keeping ambiguity constant and going from the right margin to the left, the two businesses become more different or less related, and their deployment cost hits a threshold above which the estimate for that cost held by the acquirer becomes so high that redeployment would never occur. From that threshold to the left margin, the acquirer sees no economies from undertaking due diligence, from acquiring the target, and from redeploying resources between the merged businesses, thus fully refraining from the deal. Letting ambiguity vary affects how far from the right margin the threshold for redeployability is located. The second plot in this slide depicts the net return to the acquirer that results from the optimal due diligence effort diagnosed in the first figure. The main result here is that the plot has an interior peak. the peak is outside the bottom right corner, where redeployability is the highest and ambiguity is the lowest. The acquirer does not find it profitable in that corner to bid for the target as much as another buyer offers, and nearly as much as the target is actually worth. And even if the focal acquirer buys the target for such a high price, it gets what it pays for, resulting in zero net return to the acquirer in the bottom right corner anyway. This location of the peak determines that the acquirer net return has inverse U-shaped relationships, both with redeployability and with ambiguity. In other words, neither the weakest nor even the strongest relatedness involved in redeployability leads to the highest net return to the acquirer. Also, neither the highest nor even the lowest ambiguity about the target maximizes the acquirer net return. The next slide shows the effects of a synergy and of ambiguity on the optimal due diligence effort. In this second set of results, synergy captures relatedness between the merging businesses. The following patterns are noteworthy here. First, the lack of synergy at the left margin totally discourages due diligence. If the two businesses are drastically different from each other, they cannot share resources with each other, and synergy is unlikely anyway. Regardless of whether resources have ever been tried to be shared between the two businesses, and regardless of the resulting ambiguity, trivial synergy leaves no room for information asymmetry between the acquirer and another buyer. Both are very pessimistic about such economies. Second, if synergy is non-trivial, this is always optimal for the acquirer to undertake some due diligence, to acquire the target, and to share resources between the two businesses. Beyond enabling the effect of ambiguity, non-trivial synergy has no individual effect on optimal due diligence. In this case, ambiguity becomes the dominant determinant of due diligence. The second plot shows that when the acquirer uses due diligence optimally, its net return has a peak that is on the right margin and is very close to, but not exactly on the bottom margin. The peak does not coincide with the bottom right corner because on the bottom margin, there is no information asymmetry between alternative buyers, and the focal acquirer does not find it profitable to bid for high synergy as much as another buyer bids, and as much as that synergy is actually worth. Thus, this figure reconfirms the inverse U-shaped relationship between the acquirer net return and ambiguity observed in the previous slide for redeployability. So what are the key takeaways from these results? First, we addressed the important question, how diligent must corporate acquirers be? Based on advice of consultants, management gurus, and strategy textbooks, and based on the high intensity of positive mentions of due diligence in research, acquirers cannot be too diligent. All these sources concurred in warning acquirers, watch out. Our study sends a more specific and therefore a more accurate message. We place due diligence in the context of economies of scope present in M&As, and we ask how diligent a corporate acquirer must be with different economies. Our study derives a set of specific prescriptions on the optimal extent of due diligence. Besides, we elaborate upon how resource relatedness, the chief determinant of economies of scope, affects value realized in M&As when information about such economies is incomplete. The presence of ambiguity about economies of scope revises the relationship with which relatedness monotonically enhances value realized in merged firms. When ambiguity about economies of scope is present, and when due diligence of such economies is costly, an intermediate rather than the highest level of relatedness present in redeployment of resources between the merged businesses leads to the highest net return to the acquirer. Finally, We qualify the strategic use of incomplete information with which the quality of information about the target is managed by an acquirer rather than is taken as given, in contrast to the prevalent view based on the avoidance of deals with difficult to evaluate targets. This study demonstrates that some ambiguity is actually necessary to make the deal profitable to an acquirer. In the absence of such ambiguity, even very high economies of scope alone cannot justify the deal. Our model shows that an intermediate rather than the strongest or the highest ambiguity about economies of scope leads to the highest acquirer return. Thank you for watching this presentation. Please watch other videos on my YouTube channel on resource redeployment.